Hello students, you're welcome to this last lecture for this semester. That is chapter 12 and it's to do with Psalms. In Psalms we have biblical prayer and praise. We conclude our study of Old Testament at a note of worship, recounting the greatness of God and the hope He has given us. Psalms is divided into 5 literal books. That is, the first one is from chapter 1, chapter 44, chapter 42 to chapter 72, chapter 73, chapter 89, chapter 90 to chapter 106, and then chapter 107 to chapter 150. The book of Psalms can also be looked at as representing 5 aspects. The 5 aspects are a prayer book of Adam. In other words, we can look at Psalms in these aspects or from these dimensions. A prayer book of Adam. Secondly, a prayer book of the king. Thirdly, the prayer book of Israel. Fourthly, the prayer book of Jesus. And finally, the prayer book of the church. So we're going to look at each one of these, how Psalms are able to address and how they can be looked from each of these dimensions. But first, let us look at the objectives which are going to guide us as we explore this chapter. The first objective, which we should get by the end of this lecture, is define 5 perspectives by which Christians may regard the book of Psalms as a prayer book. Those are the perspectives I've been talking about and which we're going to expound on. 2, describe the architectural, poetic, musical, and dramatic character of Israel's Psalms. In other words, we shall look at these Psalms also, and in it we see how they describe the architecture, the poetry, the music, and the drama just in these Psalms. 3, outline the themes of the hymns using one example from the Psalter. So we shall look at the themes and how they move and how they are developed. And then objective number 4, outline the themes of prayer, that is lament, using one example from the Psalter. And finally, review the key characteristics of God's revealed nature as portrayed in the dynamic language of the Psalms. Psalms as a book of prayer. The book of Psalms is a literal Bible and therefore has major themes that run in God's word from beginning to end. Canonical editors have parceled the Psalms into 5 books. That is chapter 1, chapter 41, 42 to 72, 73 to 89, 90 to 106, and 107 to 150. That's how the editors have come up with this. As Christians, we may also look at Psalms from 5 perspectives. And we're going to be looking at each one of these, if I can repeat for you, as a book of Adam, as a prayer book of Adam, also the prayer book of the king, the prayer book of Israel, the prayer book of Jesus Christ, and the prayer book of the church. And King David was author of many of them. The first one, the prayer book of Adam. In the poem of John Mbiti, portrays Adam and Eve as concluding the day in the hymn. And if you look at Psalm 1, the psalmist opens by establishing the powerful concept that those who obey the Lord shall be blessed, and those who do not and who mock God will face judgment. So in a way, as you look at these Psalms, you find it's as if it's Adam and Eve, they are concluding the good day in the hymn. So in a way, it's a prayer book of Adam. But also, we want to look at it also as a prayer book of the king. David is traditionally known as the author of the Psalter. Many are titled of David. It is more important to note that Psalms are an expression of the Davidic covenant. The king is God's representative on earth, and his kingship is opposed by the enemies of God. So in this way, from this perspective, you will understand that actually Psalm is just a prayer book of the king. If you read Psalm 2, we learn that leaders and kings are servants of the Lord, and nations are meant to live in obedience to God. No one can be free to operate successfully without God. just as a fish and a tree cannot live without water and soil, respectively. In other words, the king represents God. And so anybody who disobeys the king actually is disobeying the king himself. Rather, is disobeying God himself. So we want to look at now the prayer Psalms as a prayer book of Israel. Apart from being individual, the Psalms are frequently corporate in character, even in the royal eye. In many prayers includes the people as well. The Psalms are first used in public festivals and in the temple and have continued to form the backbone of synagogue worship. Okay, just a second. Okay, if you read Psalm 149, the purpose of mankind is to worship the Lord with our lives, including our bodies, but also with all He created. So, as we look at it from this perspective, we find that actually it's a prayer book for the Israelites because it embraces all of them. When they talk of I, they are actually meaning I, just Israel, as a nation. Now, I want to look at the prayer book, Psalm as a prayer book of Jesus Christ. In Psalm 89, verse 26 and 103, verse 13, are the only times God is likened to a father. Jesus addresses the Father in his own unique way. He found his identity and spirit rooted in the Psalms. So we find that Jesus is as if this book is his prayer book he's using. On the Easter day, for example, Jesus taught the disciples that everything must be fulfilled that is written about him in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Find that one in Luke chapter 24, verse 44, meaning the Psalms actually they're talking about Jesus. So it's a prayer book for him as well. And he says, the Psalms talked about me also. To understand this better, we must distinguish what David says of Lord, God who thrones, and Lord Messiah who is enthroned. Also compare before David was I am, meaning Jesus is saying before David was there, me I was there. So all this is trying to actually to him. Now finally, we want to look at it as a prayer book of the church, Psalms. So St. Paul sets a pattern for the church worship when he commanded the Colossians to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. So in Paul's teaching, instead of people remaining gossiping and having nothing to do in the church, he encourages them to sing the psalms, meaning it's a prayer book for the church. Christians address specific hymns to Christ, but also continue to pray and sing the psalms of Israel. They didn't leave it with the Jews, but find the Christians are using psalms. Psalm has been a part of all Christian liturgy and many favorite hymns, and modern choruses are psalms paraphrases. So, in addition to public worship, the psalms have been the constant companion of the individual in his prayer closet. What I'm saying, if you can remember in your local churches, you realize that these psalms are being sung. Psalm 100, Psalm 95, Psalm 50. So they are always sung every morning, meaning it's a prayer book for the church, and Paul encourages it. Now, that is the different five perspectives how the church can be seen. So, worship at the Lord's house. Pilgrims to the road to Jerusalem would recite the Psalm of Ascent. In other words, they sing it as they're climbing up the hill. Psalm 122, verse 1. It seems that many, if not most, were written for use by priests and people at the sacrifices and feasts of the temple. We see a soundtrack of the book of Leviticus. The Psalms bring out the architecture, poetry, music, and drama. So, as we look at the Psalms, as these people are moving up the hill, as they are rejoicing, we now want to identify these things here. One, we want to identify the architecture. So, as somebody in the Psalms, somebody in the Psalms alone can understand how Jerusalem was like, how the temple was built. We look at the poetry, how they used to recognize some of the things. We look at the music, how they used to dance, plus the drama involved in the dances. Architecture in the Psalms. Many Psalms bring out to Jerusalem and Zion as the city enthroned was affectionately called. So the Psalms are bringing out Jerusalem, they are bringing out Zion. The Psalms lovingly describe the city with its roads, its springs, its walls, and the Temple Mount with its fortress, its gates, its courts, its pillars. So at least they are trying to bring us the imagination of how architecturally Jerusalem was built, or Mount Zion. In my local language, you call it also Zion. Rukasimbu Hamwandara, Kike Kirutengesa. So here we are able to see the architecture. If you are not an engineer, or if you are an engineer, you can be able to understand this. You can easily get the impression of the city. Secondly, we see the image of God's dwelling place is a sign of joy and hope. But at the exile, it also became a symbol of shame and grief. So the remembering of this would give them joy. But when they went into exile, they would remember it and cry and grieve over Israel. They just remember the cities, they remember the springs, the walls, the temple, the beautiful, how it was made with all the architecture, the gates, the pillars. So we leave the architecture alone. Now let us look at the poetry in the Psalms. The lyric poetry in the Psalms is universally beloved. The poetry is based on the feature of parallelism, which appears in intricate variation. Within the tapestry of parallel verses, the psalmist weaves together conventional moral language and distinctive imagery. He uses generalized terms for good and evil, such as faithfulness, mercy, truth, and peace, or wickedness, enemies, destruction, and death. This nature of generalization has permitted generations of believers to apply the Psalms to their particular need. Remember, when we talked about lyric poetry in our first chapter, we said this is the kind of literature which appeals to somebody's imagination. And so the imaginations are brought in here so that the person who is reading is attracted, is convinced, and is convicted to take a decision. Psalms often employ vivid images drawn from nature or myth. Now, we want to see the music in the Psalms. Although there is lyrics without musical score, the parallelism gives us a sense of the rhythm of the psalm model. What am I saying? Although we don't have the music, the solofa notation, the staff notation, we don't have them handed over to us. But the fact that you look at some of the verses repeated just shows you the parallelism. You see the sense of rhythm of the psalm model. It's clear most of the psalms were sung, sometimes with a chorus. If you read Ezra chapter 2, verse 65, there are also hints that psalms were sung with musical accompaniments. So you see this psalm exists 149, 150, and the others. They are encouraging people to play the harps, to play all this. And of course, when we talk of instruments being played, it means there's a rhythm involved. And you can't sing, play harp when there's no music. So all these are bringing it out that we have music in the Psalms. Psalm 150 is a psalm of praise to God for his acts of power in creation and for his redeeming and forgiving us. The psalmist expresses all the feelings like sorrow and joy, discouragement and thanksgiving, fears for enemies, and fear of death. So all that God created should be used to worship him. This may vary from culture to culture. Now let us look at the drama as found in the Psalms. To singing, the Psalms were accompanied with dramatic movements. This includes the drama of the sacrifices that were often accompanied. The worshipper lifts up his eyes, his hands, his soul to the Lord. He shouts and cries out in joy or grief. All this, when they are coming up, that means there's drama. People are not stationary as they're dancing or as they're praying. They're lifting up hands. You face this way. Let the sacrifice face this side. So all that kind of stuff, that is drama, we see addressed by the Psalms. So Psalm 81, music, worship, and drama go hand in hand. Worship involves the whole person, and music helps lift a person's thought and emotions to God. Through music, we can reflect upon our needs and failures, but also celebrate the goodness of the Lord. Okay, now we go to hymns. So what is expressed in music, I've left it. Now I want to go to another part which is called hymns, because now we have been in, in Psalms. Okay, now Psalms, of course, we have hymns, enthronement, enthroned on the praises of Israel. The Psalms are the most striking examples of lyric poetry in the Bible. Critics have identified a number of forms of Psalms. Of these, the most important are hymn and prayer. So we're going to look at hymns. We have hymns, which I've been talking about, and then we're going to look at the prayer. Two hymn and prayer. A hymn is a psalm that extols God in his character and deeds. Hymns proceed out of the fullness of God and thankful hearts of his people. What makes somebody sing, for example, if the president has visited or if the king has visited, people will come to sing for him out of fullness or out of the goodness of the person. Similarly, these people would come to sing to God, and as they are singing, they are bringing out the goodness of God as they feel it in the heart. So some of these psalms are in form of hymns. They do not ask or do anything, rather they simply rejoice in the presence of God. In this sense, they are the purest form of worship. Okay, the form of the hymn. The hymn is normally circular in its use of refrain and repetitions and simple development of them. Okay, for example, Psalm 67. If you use Psalm 67, for example, we find verse 1 starts with blessings. They're singing about God's blessings. Verse 2, they develop the blessings, they're developing it. And then in verse 3, we have refrain or sermons, which comes in there. I would ask you practically to look at this psalm and you read it. Then verse 4, you see development coming up. And after development, there's refraining. After refraining, then we have development. And finally, we have blessing in verse 7. Okay, hymns of hymns. The theme of the hymns can be summed up as follows: God reigns in his kingdom through his Messiah. So these are the themes mainly. God reigns in his kingdom through his Messiah. And of course, Messiah, this was maybe referring to their king by then, but it means the chosen one, the anointed one. These pick up the elements of God's promise of presence, place, and blessings. These threefold them can be traced in three types of hymns called enthronement, that's salvation psalms, Zion psalms, and royal psalms. So we're going to first break and then come to continue on this threefold as we look at how they bring up enthronement, Zion, and psalms. Thank you.